Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Near Memo, episode 181, the Halloween edition. We don't have any scary stories to tell, or maybe we do.
But actually, I have a scary story. I live near Buffalo, and it's going to be a high of 76 today on Halloween. Yeah. When I was raising my children, we'd go out on Halloween and we'd have to be in 3 layers of clothing. So,
that is a scary story.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we could use some of that out here in the Pacific Northwest. It's about 42 and just pouring rain. So,
it rained here in the Bay Area. It was 49 when I woke up, and it rained last night.
Yeah.
So what we're going to be talking about today is AI overviews in local. The new 18.1 iOS Siri and how it handles local, and then some newish survey data about the growth of ChatGPT and why that may or may not be showing up in Google's earnings results or Google's public statements about usage. So, David, why don't we start with you and the AI overviews piece that Andrew Shotland wrote about?
Yep. So Andrew Shotland, local SEO guide. If you're listening to this podcast and you don't know who Andrew is, I would be shocked. But at any rate, head over to local SEO guide. And Andrew published a pretty long piece using, I believe, SEMrush data, looking at tens of thousands of keywords with some sort of local relevance to see how often AI overviews were showing up was kind of part one of his piece. And then in part two, he looked at local queries on Search GPT and Perplexity. So the sort of big takeaway, I think the biggest takeaway was that Perplexity seemed to do actually a really good job with local searches. And Greg, I know you've been a Perplexity user for a little while now,
but not for local.
Not for local.
Not for local.
He gave it some relatively difficult queries, I thought, and something like, find me a Ford Bronco less than $28,000 near me or something like that. And it actually showed him a list of local car dealers with that kind of query. So, pretty interesting in terms of how well Perplexity is doing. He said Search GPT was pretty terrible, actually, which reinforces a point that Mike's made in particular on this podcast about Google's local knowledge graph being a real sort of competitive moat when it comes to, generative AI search. And then in terms of the AI overviews, he found something that I think we've all felt anecdotally. I certainly have felt in my client work in terms of reviewing actual SERPs for keywords that they might want to show up in, which is that AI overviews just don't show up all that often for low funnel local search queries where you typically would expect to see a pack. You rarely would see an AI overview and a pack, for example. Generally speaking, Google just isn't showing AI overviews for those queries. They are showing them much more for sort of quasi-informational queries that are somewhat tangentially related to local. So the examples that Andrew gave for, by and large, were around like home services, how to do something or how much, those kinds of queries. Still very informational in nature, but where you might have seen a directory showing up for those queries historically. So overall, the big takeaway was just, hey, don't panic if you're in local search that AI overviews aren't necessarily coming for a lot of your traffic, at least not yet. And that even if search does move platforms to something like Perplexity or what Search GPT is sort of going for, that they are still going to return a lot of local businesses there. So if you're a directory, you might be in a little bit of trouble. But if you're a local business, you're still Google and all these other generative AI products and platforms, they still have to send consumers to an actual local business at the end of the day. So it just might be a different source of traffic. And you sort of your website might not be viewed as much in the consideration phase as it is today if you're doing a great job with SEO.
So Perplexity's licensing Yelp data. They're licensing the Yelp API, whatever that is called formally, and so that's where they're getting a lot of their local information. Probably not all of it. They're probably crawling for some of it, but that's where it's partially coming from. And I understand this may be inaccurate, but my understanding from Yext, this is not formal, this is just an informal conversation with somebody, is that Yext is providing data to some of these AI platforms as well. So there may be a structured feed going going to those.
Well, and even if Yext isn't providing it directly, I'm sure all of these sites are crawling a known set of local directories to try to build their own corpus,
Well,
which Yext is probably powering a good chunk of those with their own
just
client data. So,
as a side note, Mike, I know you want to jump in, but as a side note, Facebook Meta is apparently now crawling, and they're doing a bunch of new things in local. They have a local tab that they've launched. They're building their own search engine according to the information. Hypothetically, that will include Facebook and Instagram content, much of which has a local dimension to it. So there's some interesting things going on over there. We'll have to see what shows up ultimately.
So a couple of interesting things on the ChatGPT front. Apple Maps went to a web version very recently. And when you looked at the timing of their announcements and ChatGPT search announcements, it looked like ChatGPT might have been pulling punches, allowing Apple to both announce the ChatGPT relationship and announce the web map prior to ChatGPT saying they were going to be in a search engine. So there may be a play for ChatGPT to get Apple's data through scraping that way, because a lot of that data is proprietary to Yelp or TripAdvisor or whoever, and I don't think Apple could share it. The other thought I had, though, is that Google is missing an AI overview opportunity to create a local product that breaks through the sort of rigidity and brittleness of local search. Local search has a problem, at least for me rurally. I'm willing to travel 70 or 80 miles to solve my problems, whether that's a physician or a car dealer or dinner. And that happens all the time. But if you try to do that query, show me the best heart doctor in 100 miles of Olean, it doesn't happen. And I think AI overviews could break through the sort of rigidity of the local algorithm to answer those questions. I think it's an area that Google is missing out on. I think a lot of people would welcome an alternative view of local answers that are not bound by a 2-mile radius or whatever the portal happens to be. It's interesting to me, though, the relationship between Apple and ChatGPT. I'm wondering if ChatGPT is in fact going to be, and anybody else, going to be scraping the Apple knowledge graph of local, which is maybe not as good as Google's, but it's
pretty good.
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Yeah. It's worth noting that during the SGE phase, we saw knowledge graphs for almost every single local query, and it was largely just a duplication, sort of an expanded duplication of what was going on in the local pack. I mean, sometimes there were anomalous businesses that were not sort of showing up in the local pack, or not highly ranked organically. But it seemed like Google didn't really know what to do with AI overviews with local, because they have this very well established local pack, and they were kind of not, your suggestion is a good one. My earlier suggestion was that they just replace the local pack with an AI overview that contains the top ranking local businesses and has more information in it. But that's not materialized either.
And they also did the play with Google Maps, where it was terrible experience because it was so slow. They did a beta test. So
I was going to say, Mike, it feels to me like they're going 180 degrees from what you're suggesting, which I agree would be at least a worthy experiment to try to see if they could pull it off, first of all, and if users engage with it. But instead, this very sort of I don't even know exactly what to call it, but it's certainly uncreative thinking from my standpoint of these AI organized pages, which are just blocks of Google business profiles, which are, take a really long time to scroll. There's no guarantee that the mechanism for organization is even what you're looking for as a user. And it's a very I think it's just a bizarre user experience. And they seem to be doubling or tripling down on that, as opposed to totally radically rethinking the way that they approach local. So that's my first comment. My second comment is, I totally agree with you on even as an urban user, that there are certain categories for which I'm willing, I actually want to know, a much wider array of things. Like if I search for best Indian food in Portland, it's probably going to show me like 3 restaurants that are right around me. as I know as a longtime Portlander, like the best Indian restaurant is actually out in Hillsborough, which is 20 miles away, and I would never see that in a search. And so I think that's a really great sort of insight in terms of like not, Google's again just sort of just the way that they've always done things. We're going to continue to do things even though we now have this new tool in our toolkit, and I think that it's an opportunity for the Perplexities and the Search GPTs and maybe even the Apples to radically rethink how these results are calculated and presented.
Another thing they could do with AI overviews that would be very complementary is that they could provide context for whatever the local search is, right? So if you're doing a home services query for handyman or kitchen remodeling or whatever it is, they could provide informational context, things you should know, things you should think about, pricing, whatever, that would be quite complementary. But that, they don't necessarily need to do that. That would be helpful to searchers, the publishers who say, here are the, or lists, the listicles, the 10 bests or whatever, that would be complementary to the local pack, but they're, I don't foresee them doing that.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.